So Ethan, you've walked us through the basic disassembly and general maintenance required with this M2. But what about for the guys who might want to take things a step further?
Yeah, there may be a time for that. If you have an older gun that maybe seems a little sluggish, like the action's slowing down.
Okay.
Or if it's gotten really wet or dirty and you want to break it down further.
Right. Okay.
We'll do that now. We'll start by removing the magazine spring.
Okay.
And there's a spring retainer on the end of the tube here. And I do this just with a flathead screwdriver. And you want to be careful here. The magazine spring is strong. It's a lot of tension. But I pry it out with a flathead screwdriver.
Okay.
So there's our spring retainer. And there's the magazine spring and the limiter plug. And then in here, we have a magazine follower.
Okay.
We'll then go to the trigger assembly. And to remove that, there's one pin that goes either way through the side of the receiver. That's right here. We can take a punch and tap that out. That's the trigger guard pin. To remove the trigger assembly, we have to push the bolt release button.
Okay. That
levers the shell latch out of the way and allows the trigger guard to drop out of the receiver.
Perfect. So if you're having trouble getting that out, it's probably because you forgot to push this in.
Yeah, and that's also very important when reinstalling the trigger guard. Be sure to push that button.
Okay.
Exactly. There is a recoil spring and plunger system inside the stock. We'll go ahead and get to that as well.
Okay.
To remove the recoil pad, I take my thumbs, push on one side, and it pops right off.
Okay.
There is a 13mm stock nut down inside here, which we can use a socket wrench or a T-handle to loosen. Once that nut has been removed, the stock will slide away from the recoil tube. And inside the stock, we have some hardware. There's our locking plate, lock washer, and stock nut. Up here we have our drop shim and our cast shim. This tube here, there's a spring and a plunger inside, and to get to it there's a plug on the back with flats, and you can use a 17mm wrench to remove it.
Okay.
If this has never been off before, it will be a little tight. There's a nylon ring on there that holds it in place. So if you need to, you can put the receiver in a padded vise. You never want to put the tube in a vise. That could damage it, but the receiver is okay. We'll take a 17mm wrench, unscrew that plug.
And so that will be under pressure there too as well, right?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a spring in here, so we want to be careful. There's our recoil spring and the recoil spring plunger. Now, if you have an older gun where this has never been out, this could be a pretty dirty area.
Okay.
Unburned powder and that kind of thing can build up back here. So it's an area we want to clean. Clean all the coils on the spring, make sure it's free of rust. This plunger, we can oil this fairly heavily while it's out, because it may not come out for another 10 years.
Right.
So we'll take some oil all along the outside of the plunger. Up top where it rides in the tube, I put some all along the body. And this tube, we want to be sure is clean as well. I use something like this pistol rod with a patch to clean it out.
Okay.
So we'll reinstall our recoil spring plunger, recoil spring. And I start this one by hand. And then take our 17mm wrench and tighten. Other internal parts we'll want to clean. One will be the trigger assembly.
Okay.
I'm gonna go ahead and turn the safety off and release the hammer. Really the best way to clean this is compressed air.
Okay.
And I've got a air tool here. We can show just around the hammer spring cap, the trigger disconnector. If there is any kind of debris inside the action, this tends to be where it can settle. So
okay.
Compressed air will remove it.
So is there any oil needed on those parts?
A little bit. You don't want to over oil anything in the trigger. A little around the carrier spring here.
Okay.
Down around the hammer spring cap, hammer spring. Maybe a little on the trigger. You don't want to over oil anything. I'll take my hand sometimes and just spread it around the other metal parts.
Okay.
We'll go ahead and recock the hammer. The safety must be on fire to recock the hammer.
Okay.
Just keep that in mind. We'll also clean the bolt assembly. And we'll go ahead and fully break this down. For the bolt assembly, we'll remove the firing pin retaining pin. And that's this pin on the back. You can remove it by hand. If you can't get it, you can take a punch and go from the left side and slide it out. But always remember to hold your thumb over the back of the firing pin.
Okay.
Because it's under spring tension and it may shoot out of the bolt. So there we have our firing pin spring. Once those are out, the locking head pin will come out of its channel. The locking head will then pull out of the bolt. And you'll have to pull that because there's the easy lock detent in there. Mm-hmm. So you have to pull the locking head to get it past that detent.
Okay.
And there's one more part in the bolt, and that's the inertia spring.
Okay.
And we need to get it past that detent as well. So you may need something like a small pick to hook that and slide it out. For the bolt, I like to take a nylon brush and just brush out these notches. They are what operate the carrier, and you want them to be free of any buildup. Also the front of the bolt, the locking head, anywhere along here. And it's very important that the firing pin will protrude through the hole in the locking head. If it will not, you can use the firing pin to actually clean that out, or even a small drill bit of this diameter.
Okay.
Just spin it in by hand, and you can remove some
just
of that
to make
buildup.
sure it'll go all the way through.
Right, that's right. Before we reassemble the bolt, I like to oil the inertia spring and the locking head. And I probably put a little too much there. I'm going to move some of that around. The inertia spring, push back in the body. The locking head goes back in the bolt. The locking head pin, see, it has a line on top. That line can go either way.
Okay.
That's just what indicates where the hole is that the firing pin needs to go through. We can then take our firing pin and spring and insert them in the back of the bolt. And then by hand we just push our firing pin retaining pin back inside, and it's all set.
Okay.
We'll leave the handle out for now so we can slide it back in the receiver. So then we can go ahead and reassemble. First, I'm going to go ahead and take the trigger assembly. And here, remember to push that bolt release button so we can get the guard back in the receiver. The trigger guard pin. Tap it back in place. We'll then put our stock back on. Drop and cast shim. Take the stock. Slide that over the recoil tube. Our locking plate. Seats in the back of the stock. And then we just have a lock washer and a nut to tighten down.
Okay.
And that nut, as a reminder, is a 13 millimeter. The recoil pad, we can simply push back on by hand.
Okay.
For the magazine spring and the follower, we'll start with the magazine follower. And inside this magazine, you want this to be dry.
Okay, keep that dry.
Yeah, and that could be an area where feathers and sand and that kind of stuff build up. So make sure it's clean, but don't oil the magazine parts.
Right.
Just leave it dry. We can then take our magazine spring and our limiter plug. For hunting most species in most states, you'll need that limiter plug in there. And push them back in by hand. And then I'll take the magazine spring retainer and tap that back in with a rawhide mallet.
Okay.
We can then slide our bolt back in the receiver and reinstall the bolt handle by pushing it in place. And that's it. That's the advanced disassembly and maintenance of an M2.
Okay. And once again, hopefully we don't have to do this very often.
Not something you'll have to do often,
okay,
for sure.
Great. If you have any further questions about specs, details, or other info on your Benelli M2, refer to your owner's manual or visit BenelliUSA.com.